Bangladesh, A Legacy of Blood by Anthony Mascarenhas. Chapter 3, The Decline of the Demigod. Part 1. The army will not fire on the people, but if you press it, it might take action against you and the ruling clique. Abdurrab. The scene, Bolton Maidan, Dhaka. The date, 17 September 1972. The occasion, the first public protest against Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's rule. 8 months after he had taken over as prime minister, the tide of popularity had begun to run out for Mujib. The great agitator, the champion of the people's grievance, the beloved Bangabandhu on whom the most fulsome praise had been lavished, had now become the target of criticism from an outraged public. More than 100,000 people had gathered to hear another powerful rabble-rouser bitterly denounce the prime minister for betraying the Bengalis and failing to fulfill pledges made before independence. He was Abdur Rauf, the student leader and former Mukti Bahini freedom fighter, who was once one of Mujib's staunchest supporters. Now Rauf was telling the crowd, quote, Mujib said no one would be allowed to die of starvation after independence. Now people are dying for want of food. Egged on by the irate gathering, Rauf ticked off a long string of grievances, soaring prices, which put food and other necessities beyond reach of the people, shortages, market manipulation, official corruption, nepotism, mounting unemployment, mass arrests and beatings by the police, an irresponsive government, a muzzled press. Quote, the Awami League are more corrupt and much worse than the Pakistanis ever were, Rauf declared, in a paunchy summation of public sentiment that brought the crowd screaming to its feet. Quote, you have been arresting us and using all sorts of violence against us. In your speeches, you have used the metaphor of weapons. But have you ever used a gun? We know how to use real weapons, close quote. The calling for the dismissal of corrupt cabinet ministers and officials and the formation of a national government, Rauf prophetically warned Mujib, quote, the army will not fire on the people, but if you press it, it might take action against you and the ruling clique, close quote. The wheel had turned full circle for the Bengalis. Once more, there was an outcry against exploitation and repression. Only this time, ironically, Rauf was echoing the charges Mujib had hurled against the Pakistan government 18 months earlier. For Mujib, it was an especially bitter pill. 3 days earlier, he had returned from an extended visit to London, where he had undergone a painful operation for the removal of gallstones. He was still a sick man and very exhausted. A 10-day convalescence in Geneva, away from the crowds of importuning Bengalis who had descended on him in London, had failed to improve his disposition. During his enforced absence, the government was formally headed by Sayyid Nuzrul Islam, the deputy prime minister, but he had neither the intelligence nor the political muscle to assert himself. The savage infighting among the Awami League leaders had resurfaced. Cabinet ministers, like so many defiant warlords, went their separate ways. In London and in Geneva, Mujib had once more been overwhelmed by panic calls from Dhaka. For 7 weeks, Bangladesh was at the mercy of God and the telephone. Now Mujib was back, and after an orchestrated welcoming, was publicly pilloried on the Bolton Maidan. It all came as a nasty jolt to his ego, but for Mujib there was no contrition, only a shifting of blame from the master to his dogs. I am with the people, he declared on his return, as though dissociating himself from the party. He turned on his party men, dismissing 19 members of parliament for, quote, smuggling, nepotism, and corruption. This unprecedented purge of the ruling party was well received. When Mujib wrathfully announced, nobody will be spared, I will take action against anyone who is guilty, many saw this as an indication that the old dynamism of the hustings had returned, and they ardently believed that given the opportunity, Mujib would yet vindicate the public trust. A Bengali journalist told me, quote, "Leader will strengthen things out. Now you'll see the fun," close quote. That would be another promise belied. The events, however, did mark a new phase in Mujib's decline. Henceforth, he increasingly temporized with all sorts of political stunts, deluding himself that bravado and showmanship would substitute for his deficiencies as the executive head of government. In the process, he discarded everything Bangladesh was supposed to represent: constitutionalism, the rule of law, freedom of speech, the right to dissent, equal opportunity. Gradually, tragedy in Bangladesh settled into permanence. If the new state did not collapse within the first 8 months of its founding, it was only due to the efforts of the international community. UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Operation in Dhaka, was an unprecedented rescue mission, both in magnitude and effectiveness. One of UN's unsung success stories. Even the name signified a practical effort to cut through formalities, legalities, and red tape, to come to terms with the explosive reality of 75 million people in the gravest distress. Since the area, hitherto East Pakistan, was still formally recognized as part of Pakistan, a member state, the UN operation could not be designated as aid to Bangladesh. To give it the East Pakistan label would similarly have been offensive to the sensitive Bengalis and their international friends. So the UN relief operation to Dhaka was launched, and with it, the greatest single international outpouring of money, food, equipment, and technical assistance known to date. At least 20 countries were represented in Dhaka with men and materials. Money, men, and supplies also came in from the ICRC, the International Committee for Red Cross in Geneva, and its affiliates, particularly the Norwegian and Swedish Red Cross societies, and from a number of German and British charities, such as Caritas, War on Want, Save the Children Fund, and Christian Aid. UNRWA coordinated this gigantic operation. It had some difficult moments. Sometimes there were some hilarious boners, even heated debates about the type of operation it should be, and there was some corruption, of course. But its ultimate success is judged by the fact that not only did it save Bangladesh from collapse, but UNRWA was also generally free from contention and recrimination by the local government and the people it sought to help. Although food was scarce and available on the open market only at a mounting premium, UNRWA ensured that the statutory ration of rice was maintained. Bengalis did not die of starvation while UNRWA organized the supply and distribution of food. I remember an enormous chart hanging on the wall of the Dhanmondi office of Dr. Victor Umbrecht, UNRWA's director. Popularly called the bed sheet, it could easily cover a fair-sized bed. It served as a ready reckoner for the war damage, the money or supplies available for rehabilitation from donor countries, and the various task forces in the field. UNRWA estimated there were 10 million people destitute in the rural areas and another 2 million in towns. At least 1.5 million houses had to be rebuilt, but the immediate requirement in the spring of 1972 was 78 million US dollars for housing and food, 80 million US dollars for additional food imports, 200 million for industrial and agricultural inputs and equipment, 45 million US dollars for housing materials, 15 million US dollars for railway repairs, 13 million US dollars for inland water transport, and 6 million US dollars for schools. UNRWA had its own wireless network and transport system, with the blue United Nations flag flown on mini bulkers, trucks, helicopters, aircraft, and barges. Russian and Indian Navy salvage teams cleared the wrecks, blocking Chittagong and Khulna ports and the Jalna anchorage. British Army engineers repaired the big bridges in the north. Indian technicians helped to restart the railways. Scandinavian doctors and nurses worked round the clock to control epidemics of smallpox, cholera, and typhoid. There were hundreds of East European engineering specialists repairing war damage, an American specialist working entirely with local dock labor, and the most primitive equipment set a record for clearing food ships in Khulna. French and Japanese technicians helped to restart the mills. Correspondents wanting a quick rundown on the way things were shaping would make a beeline for UNRWA headquarters, where the amiable director of information, Fernando Jacques de Silva, would provide instant answers. This remarkable Brazilian, who after hours would regale us with refreshment and his guitar, did much to keep the massive rehabilitation effort in perspective. While spelling out what the UN specialists were doing, he would quietly promote the idea of close cooperation between UNRWA and the Bangladesh government, and in no way discount the latter's overall responsibility. Thus, to the government's satisfaction, press reports invariably gave the impression of Bangladesh achievement, whereas UNRWA, in fact, was doing all the pushing and most of the running. One evening, during an informal conversation over dinner, Dr. Umbrecht appeared to be concerned about a meeting he had earlier in the day in the Bangladesh Foreign Office. Quote, "I can't understand why," he told me with evident exasperation, "if the government is so anxious to join the United Nations and receive international recognition, it is refusing to attend a UN-sponsored conference." It transpired that Bangladesh, though still far from being admitted to membership of the world body, had been extended an official invitation to participate in the Conference on the Environment in Stockholm. The invitation was unconditional and would have marked Bangladesh's first appearance on the international forum. Nevertheless, Dr. Umbrecht, as the UN representative in Dhaka, had been called to the Foreign Office that morning and given a letter expressing the government's inability to attend. The formal excuse was that it was not fully geared to participate, but Dr. Umbrecht had been privately informed about the real reason. Apparently, the German Democratic Republic, which had rushed in to open the first diplomatic office in Dhaka, and like Bangladesh was not a member of the United Nations, had also received an invitation to Stockholm, but only as an observer. Because of this qualification, the GDR refused to attend. So it had been suggested to Bangladesh by its East European friends that as a gesture of solidarity with the countries which had given ardent support to the struggle for independence, it should also refrain from attending. The Foreign Office at that time was presided over by Abdus Samad Azad, the man with the pro-Russian label who had summarily replaced Kondukar Mustaq Ahmed. Azad decided to make the gesture to the East Europeans, and after issuing the required directive to the permanent head of the Foreign Office, S.A. Karim, flew off on an official visit to Nepal. Next morning, which was a Sunday, I walked over to Bongabhavan for a quiet chat with Mujib and casually brought up the question of the rejected invitation without mentioning my source. Mujib was in an upstairs bedroom, chatting with Law Minister Kamal Hussain, while his servant vigorously massaged his legs. That was Mujib's way of relaxing. My question seemed to disturb him. Abruptly sitting up on the bed, Mujib told me with unconcealed irritation, "What nonsense are you talking? Have you also started picking up bizarre rumors?" We have not received any UN invitation, so how can we reject it? Properly chastened and smarting from the outburst, I wondered why Dr. Umbrecht was trying to sell me a line. In that mood, I looked him up on my return to Hotel International. He was both annoyed and puzzled by the imputation of Mujib's denial. To prove the point he had made earlier, he showed me a copy of the politely worded Foreign Office refusal. I went back to Mujib that evening and told him that far from being bazaar gossip, I could prove that the great Prime Minister was not aware of what was going on under his very nose in the Foreign Office. The upshot was that Mujib sent for the Foreign Secretary and, after establishing the truth of the matter, reversed the decision. Dr. Umbrecht was warmly received by the Prime Minister and told that the Bangladesh ambassador to Stockholm had been instructed to attend. 2 days later, when Mujib confronted the Foreign Minister on his return from Nepal, Abdul Samad Azad hotly denied having issued the order. Mujib knew this to be a barefaced lie. Nevertheless, he accepted Azad's contention that Foreign Secretary S.A. Karim had acted without his knowledge. The latter, in disgust, asked to be relieved of his post and went to New York as the resident observer at UN headquarters. By the summer of 1972, everything was going wrong for Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Rice is the staple food of the Bengalis, and its price is always the definitive indicator of the public mood in Bangladesh. When the price is low, the administration, however unpopular it may be in other ways, can cope to muddle through. When the price is high, all the danger signals start flashing, and it is generally assumed that the government is on its way out. By June 1972, the price of paddy, the unhusked rice, had soared to 120 dakas per mond, 80 pounds, in the quote-unquote hats or country markets. That was almost double what it had been under Pakistani rule and well above the crisis level for Bangladesh. Mujib was gravely embarrassed and tried to explain it away as the consequences of the war, but hungry villagers would not be fobbed off with such an excuse when other essentials such as paraffin, cooking oil, salt, and soap were also difficult to come by because of the outrageous market manipulation. The country was in the grip of a severe money famine since unemployment, which had risen spectacularly during the Liberation War, showed no signs of declining during the peace. In the public mind, the Awami League government was not merely corrupt, it was considered to be totally degenerate. And adding to the overall distress, there was a pervasive lawlessness and violence. Armed gangs openly plundered and killed. It was a common sight in the districts to see groups of barefooted young men in lungis and jungias, or undershirts, sporting military caps and rifles, ambling through the marketplace. They had their will, be it eggs, fish, vegetables, cash, or jewelry. Even Dhaka, the capital, was not immune to their depredations. Long-haired boys with green or black berets, dark glasses, and Castro beards would tear through the streets in stolen jeeps and cars. The number plates were only casually plastered with mud. Sometimes they carried rifles and Sten guns, sometimes not. But if they didn't get their way when demands were made in shops or houses, the intended victims knew they would return after dark with guns. Mujib had dismally failed to retrieve the vast quantities of arms and ammunition which had remained in private hands in the aftermath of the war. His efforts in this direction had been inept from the start. A little more than a week after taking over as prime minister, and obviously acting on the advice of his non-combatant Awami League cabinet ministers and the bureaucrats of the quote-unquote 16th Division, who both feared the freedom fighters, Mujib suddenly issued a public directive that all unauthorized arms should be surrendered within 10 days. It was another case of the demigod commanding, "Let there be rain." The folly of the order was immediately evident, apart from the fact that the government was then incapable of enforcing its writ. The ending of the amnesty period coincided with the festival of Eid al-Adha, when the country is shut down for at least 3 days. In this case, it was the first Eid after independence, and there was an immense pressure on everyone to return to their village homes for the festivities. Consequently, the skeletal administration had begun to slow down. Even if it had wanted to, the government was not able to get the message effectively circulated in the countryside, or for that matter, arrange for the collection of arms had they been forthcoming. The timing was all wrong. Mujib was compelled to extend the deadline to the end of the month. But there was a deeper reason for the directive being ignored. The proud, patriotic, young freedom fighters of the Mukti Bahini were willing to fall behind Mujib's leadership if they could be assured of responsible positions in the new state they had helped to create. But their willingness and goodwill were undermined by Mujib's own actions. First, he had imposed his Awami League cadres, who had little or no part in the fighting, as the eyes, ears, and channels of government authority in the areas which the freedom fighters had controlled for several months. Guerrilla leaders operating under cover had, quote unquote, governed sizable chunks of territory during the Liberation War. They advised the population on resistance tactics, collected taxes to sustain the struggle, even presided over courts where justice may have been rough and ready, but invariably even-handed. Now they found themselves supplanted by Awami League leaders whose role in the freedom struggle had been minimal, if not suspect, and who now flaunted themselves as the local barons. Secondly, by adopting en masse the old East Pakistan bureaucracy, the notorious 16th Division, as the administration of Bangladesh, Mujib did not only shut the door on the freedom fighters, he also laid them open to victimization by the turncoat police and district officers who had only recently been the targets of the guerrillas. Mujib, of course, did offer to absorb the Mukti Bahini in the armed forces, the national militia, and police, or to provide grants to those who wished to return to their studies. Some did take up the offer. About 8,000 of them were absorbed in the national militia. But by and large, the freedom fighters found these options, which were never clearly spelled out, distinctly uninviting. At best, they seemed to imply subsistence level jobs for them, the true blues, while the plums went to others less deserving. So they clung to their guns. If nothing else, they were the best form of reassurance in uncertain times. Before the deadline ran out, Mujib's political advisors, after a great deal of negotiation, persuaded some guerrilla groups to ceremonially hand over their weapons to the prime minister. 2 TV spectaculars were organized for this purpose. The most impressive of these was in Tangail and involved Kader Siddiqui, the 26-year-old guerrilla leader nicknamed Tiger. He had won great distinction during the Liberation War. It was a day to remember. 10 miles into Tangail, the road on either side of Mujib's motorcade was lined at regular intervals with elements of the Kader Bahini. There were Tiger's men, each in a khaki uniform, armed with a rifle and standing stiffly to attention. Inside the town and in the vast grounds where the ceremony was held, the force and the discipline were equally impressive. This was the Tiger's territory, and he was making sure Mujib got the point. Wearing khaki uniform, his long bushy hair standing out on either side of his cap, Kader Siddiqui ceremoniously escorted Mujib past a long display of rifles, Sten guns, and at least a dozen mortars. He picked up an automatic rifle and laid it at the Prime Minister's feet in a gesture of disarmament. Then, taking rice from an aide, Tiger knelt before Mujib, a feudal lord pledging allegiance to his king. He swore he would be loyal to Mujib as long as he lived. Many others had taken the pledge before him, many since then. Only Tiger Siddiqui has kept the faith. He is now an outlaw. Mujib, who was overcome with emotion, and the officials who accompanied him would remember that day for another reason. The massive display of fighting strength, discipline, and dedication to a man other than Bangabandhu would haunt them in the days to come. The sycophants would pour poison in Mujib's ears, and he, more fearful than jealous, would try to crush the Bahini. But this would only push them underground. The surrender ceremonies had more propaganda effect than practical value. About 30,000 guns were handed in, 70,000 less than the government expected. Neither Mujib nor Khondukar Mustaka Ahmed and General Ziaur Rahman, who followed him, were able to mop up the rest. Another reason for the chaos in the country was the manner in which the collaborators' order was implemented. Promulgated on 24 January 1972, the order was intended to bring to book those who had actively collaborated with the Pakistan Army and government during the 9 months of 1971 following the army crackdown. In the circumstances obtaining at that time, it was almost a merciful alternative to uncontrolled bloodletting in the aftermath of the Liberation War. No one can fault the Bengalis for seeking to punish those who assisted the savagery perpetrated on their people. The Israelis are still doing it 40 years after Hitler. What is inexcusable is the way in which an understandable, even justifiable emotion was allowed to deteriorate into a capricious witch hunt and the paying off of old sources, of old scores. The main thrust of the order was directed against Bengali politicians who had cooperated with the Pakistan authorities, such as the former governor of East Pakistan, Dr. A.M. Malik, and his law minister, Joshimuddin Ahmed, and the pro-Pakistan armed gangs such as the Razakars and the notorious Al-Badr. The latter had been involved in acts of murder, rape, arson, and looting, and as such, the guilty ones deserved to be brought to justice. But it was invidious to single out the collaborating politicians for punishment when the entire civilian administration of East Pakistan had not only immunized from retribution, but had also been installed as the new administration of Bangladesh. When all is said and done, those government functionaries and policemen were in a natural position to collaborate, and collaborate many of them did. Yet the collaborators' order, with minor exceptions, was not directed against them. At the same time, the Awami League leaders found the order a convenient instrument to pay off old scores against political opponents and to silence the opposition. At the end of November 1972, the chief whip of the Awami League, Shah Muazzam Hussain, complained that those who were trying to oppose the party in the forthcoming general elections were the same collaborators who had sided with the Pakistan Army junta. Even some 16th Division officers seized the opportunity to hit back at unfortunate individuals who had crossed them at some time or other. All they had to do to ensure an opponent's ruin was to denounce him as a collaborator. The government did the rest. He was clamped in jail, his property was seized, all before the charge was investigated. Understandably, some tried to defend themselves against this misdirected zeal, and since guns were readily available, the violence spread. Soon the jails began to fill. On 3 October 1972, the Home Minister publicly stated that 41,800 people had been arrested under the collaborators' order. The first collaborators' trials were held in Joshore. M.R. Akhtar Mukul relates an interesting incident in his book, Mujibur Roktolal. The man in the dock who had been accused of being a Razakar stood silent when the magistrate repeatedly asked him, "Are you guilty or not guilty?" In exasperation, some lawyers in the court shouted at him, "Why don't you plead?" The man finally answered, "Sir, I'm thinking what to say." Magistrate, "What are you thinking?" Accused, pointing to magistrate, "I'm thinking that the person who occupies that chair is the one who recruited me as a Razakar. Now he has become a magistrate. It's a cruel twist of fate that I am in the dock and he is conducting my trial." Another interesting comment comes from Robert McLennan, the British MP who was an observer at the trials. Quote, "In the dock, the defendants are scarcely more pitiable than the succession of confused prosecution witnesses driven by the 88-year-old defense counsel to admit that they too serve the Pakistan government, but are now ready to swear blind that their real loyalty was to the government of Bangladesh in exile." Close quote. The whole thing was a mockery of justice. The government finally put an end to it, but not before the disorder intensified. As the violence continued to escalate in the summer of 1972, at least 36 people were officially reported killed and another 80 injured in a riot in the port of Khulna. Unofficial estimates, which were closer to the truth, put the death toll over 2,000. The incident is noteworthy because it involved the first of Mujib's experiments with private armies. This was the Lal Bahini, a paramilitary group raised by one of the prime minister's henchmen to quote-unquote control the industrial areas. They became too officious in their task, and the riot was a result of the confrontation with the police. Not long after that, Mujib, again in typical Bangabandhu fashion, issued another 2-week ultimatum. This time it was to hoarders and smugglers in Dhaka to surrender illegally held food stocks and arms. After the ultimatum ran out without noticeable results, checkpoints were established at crossroads. Police and militia searched motor vehicles and pedal rickshaws. Others raided shops and warehouses for hidden food stocks and stolen goods. The results were disappointing. A lot of small fry was netted, but the big fish got away. They always do. They were, of course, part and parcel of the government and the ruling Awami League. Corruption is not only a Bangladesh phenomenon, but few countries in the world have been so riddled with corruption as the new state was from the moment of its founding. It was as if a plague of locusts had descended on the country and set about devouring anything that offered the slightest margin of profit. And since Bangladesh was starting anew, there were endless opportunities for aggrandizement. Instances of corruption could fill several volumes. They range from petty cupidity to outrageous criminality. It's a matter of record that a certain head of a Bangladesh diplomatic mission, who had made a great display of his piety, solemnly swore an affidavit that his grandson was his son in order to claim an additional family allowance of about £50 a month. Another diplomat charged a flat 5% on all government purchases made through his mission. One of Mujib's senior officers was so adept at manipulating the food market that he arranged first a shortage of salt and then a famine of chilies before flooding the markets with imports of these items brought in by his own cargo vessels. Others manipulated the rice trade, the edible oils market. Still others organized the smuggling of jute and rice to India, and through agents in London and Singapore, controlled the fantastic Bangladesh black market in foreign exchange. Corruption was not the preserve of the Awami Leaguers and bureaucrats, but these two groups were ideally placed to make immense fortunes because they were the government. Some operated through relatives, some flagrantly in their own names. Others saw no harm in getting the Public Works Department to convert their modest village homes into well-equipped mansions. Mujib, who had a propriety attitude to the country, had no need for money. His preoccupation was power. No one has produced evidence to substantiate rumors that he had amassed a vast fortune abroad, but it is known that some members of his family, particularly his son Kamal, were not immune to helping themselves to the substantial gifts that came their way, or to get investment-free partnerships and trading ventures which seemed to attract lucrative import business. After Mujib's assassination, Brigadier Manzoor, the chief of the general staff under General Zia, citing examples of corruption, told me Mujib's brother had rapidly built up an immense fortune by concerning large numbers of barges and other rivercraft. But let it be said that in this respect, Mujib's family did not distinguish itself any more than the scores of prominent Awami Leaguers, cabinet ministers, and senior civil servants. Corrupt, money-grabbing people were to be found everywhere, even among some of the retired majors involved in Mujib's killing. Those who took less pointed a finger at those who took more. In such a convoluted society, wrongdoing was not in question. Guilt was a matter of degree. The fault lay as much in the system as in the quality of men who had come to prominence in Bangladesh. Since the country had to be restarted from a collapsed position after the war, the government had perforce to control almost every aspect of life in Bangladesh. It soon developed into a system of licenses based on an economy of want. Those who, at the various stages, controlled the issue of licenses were therefore in a preeminent position to make their demands. Graft soon became a way of life. As my Bengali friends still say, if you want to succeed, you must pay. Things got out of hand when those who controlled the system used the licenses themselves to multiply their profits many times over. In the matter of personnel, the Awami League did not have a creditable record. In fact, some ministers in Prime Minister Suhrawardi's cabinet, which ruled Pakistan in 1957, had shown themselves to be more corrupt than anything known in Pakistan till that time. When the party was installed in power in Bangladesh, it was inevitable that old habits should be given full play. The doors to corruption were opened wide when Mujib installed Awami Leaguers as his eyes and ears in every district. Subdivisions and Thana, group of villages. The intention obviously was to keep a tight grip on the country, but the party men had to be paid off in patronage. When this took the form of distribution outlets for food, consumer goods, and industrial raw materials, everyone took a cut.